Finn Calloway had been elbow-deep in a malfunctioning plasma conduit when the summons came, which meant he was in exactly the wrong position to receive orders from anyone, let alone the diplomatic corps. The message arrived via his wrist terminal in the form of a sharp double chime that made him jerk his hand back so fast, he nearly sheared off 2 fingers against the conduit's magnetic housing. He swore, extracted himself from the maintenance shaft, and squinted at the glowing text through a film of coolant grease. Report to Royal Wing. Ceremonial maintenance required. Urgent. He read it twice, certain it was meant for someone else. Someone with actual credentials and a uniform that didn't smell like recycled air filters. Finn had been on Threshold Sigil for exactly 11 hours, reassigned from his salvage crew on some bureaucratic whim he still didn't understand, and already the station was finding creative ways to waste his time. Ceremonial maintenance. He didn't even know what that meant. Polishing metals, buffing throne room floors. The station itself was a marvel he'd barely had time to appreciate. Threshold Sigil hung in the Kella drift like a steel flower, its observation decks stretching outward to catch the light of 3 nearby stars, its docking spines cluttered with vessels from a dozen species. Ancient jump gates flanked it on either side, their surfaces etched with symbols no living language could translate, still humming with residual energy from whatever civilization had built them before vanishing into the historical void. Finn had always wanted to get close to one of those gates, to run his hands along their impossibly smooth surfaces and figure out what made them tick. Instead, he was being summoned to polish something ceremonial. He made his way through corridors that shifted from industrial gray to polished white marble as he approached the diplomatic quarters, past checkpoints where guards eyed his grease-stained coveralls with barely concealed disdain. When he finally reached the Royal Wing, he was met by an attendant whose expression suggested Finn had tracked mud into a temple. The attendant said nothing, simply gestured for him to follow, and led him through halls lined with tapestries that shimmered with embedded light, depicting battles and coronations in styles that hurt to look at too long. They stopped outside a chamber sealed by a door that wasn't quite a door, more like a membrane of hardened light that rippled as they approached. The attendant spoke a phrase in a language Finn's translator couldn't parse, and the membrane dissolved. Beyond it stood a woman who made the room feel smaller just by existing in it. Princess Sarethi Valen was tall, composed, and utterly still in a way that suggested she could remain standing in that exact position for hours without discomfort. Her long ears tapered back from her temples in elegant curves, catching the ambient light, and her eyes were a shade of amber that seemed to catalog every imperfection in Finn's appearance within the first 3 seconds. She wore robes of deep blue that moved like liquid, but it was the armor standing behind her that seized Finn's attention and refused to let go. The Veshral looked like something that had grown rather than been built. Interlocking plates of dark metal, or maybe not metal, maybe something older, curved and overlapped in patterns that suggested both insect carapace and star charts. Energy conduits ran through it like veins, pulsing with a dim blue light that ebbed and flowed in irregular rhythms. It stood on a circular platform, dormant but somehow watchful, and Finn felt the irrational certainty that it was aware of him. "You are the technician," Sarethi said. "Not a question." "That's the rumor," Finn replied, tearing his eyes away from the armor. "Though I should mention my specialty is engines and hull plating, not," he gestured vaguely at the Veshral. "Whatever that is, no offense to your ceremonial needs." "It is malfunctioning," she said, as if he hadn't spoken. "Entire sections are non-responsive. Diagnostic scans return corrupted data. The right of succession is in 4 days, and if I cannot interface with the Veshral, my claim to the throne will be contested by those who would see my family's line ended." Finn blinked. That's a lot of pressure for a tune-up. Her expression didn't change, but something in the set of her shoulders suggested she was reconsidering his entire existence. The Veshral is not a machine. It is a consciousness, a relic of the architects. It has been bonded to the Valen bloodline for 1600 years. It does not malfunction. Until now. Right, Finn said, approaching the armor with the cautious optimism of someone who'd fixed stranger things. So it's sentient, ancient, and politically important. No pressure. He pulled a diagnostic scanner from his toolkit, a battered device held together with hope and solder, and ran it along the Veshral's surface. The readings made no sense. Energy signatures spiked and dropped in patterns that defied physics, and the armor's core temperature was simultaneously 15 degrees and 6,000 degrees, depending on which sensor he trusted. He frowned, leaned closer, and pressed his palm against one of the plates to check for heat transfer. The Veshral exploded into light. Energy fields snapped outward like invisible hands, wrapping around Finn's arm, his chest, pulling him forward until he was pressed against the armor's surface. He felt it in his teeth, in his spine, a vibration that wasn't quite sound and wasn't quite electricity. His vision doubled, tripled, and he saw the chamber overlaid with something else: star charts, trajectory calculations, tactical assessments scrolling past faster than thought. His nervous system lit up like a circuit board, and somewhere in the chaos he heard Saretha's voice, sharp and urgent, shouting something in her own language. The attendants burst through the membrane door, weapons raised, but Sarethi threw up a hand to stop them. Her composure had cracked just barely, and Finn saw something in her expression he couldn't quite name. Alarm, yes, but also a kind of desperate curiosity. "Out," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "All of you now." They hesitated, then obeyed, and the membrane sealed behind them. Finn was still locked in the Veshral's grip, his heartbeat synchronizing with the armor's pulse, and he managed to rasp out, "Is this normal?" "No," Sarethi said quietly, stepping closer. Her amber eyes searched his face, and for the first time since he'd entered the room, she looked uncertain. "This has never happened before." The energy fields released Finn all at once, and he staggered backward into a decorative column that turned out to be load-bearing for his dignity. He caught himself, checked that all his fingers were still attached and in the right order, and looked up to find Sarethi watching him with the intensity of someone conducting a very important experiment that had just produced impossible results. "So," Finn said, his voice only slightly unsteady, "on a scale of 1 to catastrophically bad, how worried should I be?" Sarethi didn't answer immediately. She circled him slowly, her long ears angled forward in what he was beginning to recognize as focused concentration, and he had the distinct impression of being catalogued, assessed, and filed away in some mental archive he'd never get access to. Finally, she stopped in front of him and spoke in a tone that suggested she was choosing each word with surgical precision. "The Veshral is not simply armor. It is a fragment of the architect's civilization, entrusted to bloodlines they deemed capable of bearing the responsibility. It bonds at birth to those of royal descent. It recognizes genetic markers, neural patterns, biological signatures that have been cultivated across generations." She paused, and something flickered across her face that might have been confusion or might have been fear. "It has never recognized anyone outside the Valen line, not in 16 centuries, not once." Finn processed this information while his heartbeat returned to something approaching normal. "Well, there's a first time for everything. Maybe it's lonely. Maybe it wanted to branch out, meet new people, expand its social circle." "This is not a joke, human." "Finn," he corrected automatically. "And I'm aware it's not a joke, but if I don't joke about it, I'm going to have to confront the fact that an ancient alien defense system just grabbed me like I owed it money, and I'm not ready for that conversation." Saretha's expression softened by perhaps a millimeter, which for her seemed equivalent to a standing ovation. She turned back to the Veshral, which had returned to its dormant state, the blue light in its conduits pulsing in slow, steady rhythms. "Approach it again," she said, carefully. Finn considered arguing, decided against it, and stepped forward. This time he kept his hands to himself, but the armor responded anyway. The energy fields flickered to life. gentler now, forming a lattice of light that connected him to the Veshral without pulling him in. His wrist terminal went haywire, displaying code he didn't recognize in languages that probably predated human spaceflight, and then his vision overlaid again with that strange double sight, the chamber and something else, something vast and complicated. "I'm seeing things," he said. "Diagrams, schematics, a lot of math I don't understand." Sarethi moved to his side, close enough that he could smell something like ozone and distant rainfall coming from her robes. "The Veshral is attempting to interface with you. It believes you are compatible." She hesitated, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight he hadn't heard before. "This should not be possible." Finn squinted at the overlay, trying to make sense of the flood of information. Most of it slipped past him like water, but some of it stuck. Structural diagrams of the armor, power distribution networks, weapon systems that made his salvager instincts sit up and take notice. And buried deeper, beneath layers of encryption that pulsed like a heartbeat, was something else. A countdown. "There's a timer," he said. "I think. It's hard to tell with all the cosmic screaming my brain is doing, but yeah, definitely a countdown." The energy fields released him again, and Finn took a moment to appreciate being in control of his own nervous system. He turned to face Sarethi fully, and saw that her composure had finally cracked wide open. She looked exhausted and young and deeply, profoundly worried. "I need to tell you something," she said, and guided him to a bench along the chamber's wall. They sat, and for a moment she simply stared at her hands, at the faint tracery of scars along her palms that suggested years of weapons training. "The Veshral has been behaving strangely for months, activating systems without input, running calculations we cannot interpret. My family's advisors believe it is rejecting our bloodline, that we are no longer worthy of the bond. Political rivals are using this as evidence that the Valen dynasty is failing, that the throne should pass to another house. That's why the right of succession matters so much," Finn said, pieces clicking into place. "Yes. If I cannot demonstrate full synchronization with the Veshral, if I cannot prove the bond is intact, my claim ends. My family's claim ends." She looked at him then, and he saw something raw in her expression. "And now the armor has chosen to recognize you, a human technician with no connection to our people, our history, our bloodline. Do you understand what this means? That I'm about to become the most popular person at a party I wasn't invited to." She almost smiled. "Almost. It means you are either the solution to a crisis that threatens my entire civilization, or you are the final proof that we have lost the architect's blessing." She stood, began pacing, her robes swirling around her legs. "I do not know which frightens me more." Finn watched her pace, watched the way she held herself together through sheer force of will, and felt something shift in his chest. He'd spent his life fixing broken things, systems that people had given up on, problems that seemed impossible until you looked at them from the right angle. This was bigger than a busted conduit or a failing drive core, but the principle was the same. Something was wrong and someone needed to figure out why. "Okay," he said, "let's approach this logically. The armor grabbed me. It's running a countdown to something. It's been acting strange for months. What if, and hear me out here, what if it's not rejecting your bloodline? What if it's trying to tell you something, and it just needed someone with a different kind of brain to translate?" Sarethi stopped pacing. "Explain." "You said it's a consciousness, right? Architect technology. Maybe it's been trying to communicate, but it's speaking a language your people aren't wired to understand. I come along and my nervous system is just different enough that it can use me as a bridge." He stood, warming to the idea. "That countdown, that's not a rejection, that's a warning." She studied him for a long moment, and he watched calculations run behind her amber eyes. "If you are correct, then the question becomes, what is it warning us about?" "That," Finn said, "is an excellent question, and I propose we figure it out before your political rivals decide I'm either a spy or a very elaborate prank." Sarethi moved to a console embedded in the wall, and began typing commands with practiced efficiency. I am placing you under protective observation in the royal wing. You will continue working with the Veshral, and we will determine what it is attempting to communicate. Protective observation, Finn repeated. Is that a fancy way of saying house arrest? Yes. She didn't look up from the console. But the accommodations are excellent, and the alternative is allowing the assembly to interrogate you, which I assure you would be significantly less comfortable. Well, when you put it that way. He glanced back at the Veshral, at the way its light pulsed in steady, patient rhythms. I don't suppose this comes with hazard pay. This time she definitely smiled. The protective observation quarters turned out to be larger than any apartment Finn had ever lived in, which said more about his life choices than the station's hospitality. He spent the first hour exploring rooms that seemed designed to intimidate guests into good behavior, then gave up and returned to the central chamber where they'd relocated the Veshral. The armor stood on its platform like a patient sentinel, and Finn had the increasingly uncomfortable feeling that it was waiting for him specifically. He'd been alone with it for 3 hours when the door chimed and Sarethi entered, looking like she'd aged a year in an afternoon. Her robes were slightly disheveled, her long ears angled back in what he was learning meant exhaustion or frustration, and she carried a data tablet clutched in one hand like a weapon. How did the meetings go? Finn asked, not looking up from the diagnostic interface he'd jury-rigged to communicate with the Veshral systems. Poorly. She moved to stand beside him, staring at the streams of data scrolling across his makeshift display. Counselor Tavish has formally questioned my fitness to undergo the rite. He suggests that the Veshral's erratic behavior is proof of divine disfavor, and that I should withdraw my claim in favor of his nephew. Divine disfavor, Finn repeated. That's one way to interpret ancient technology having opinions. The Assembly does not distinguish between technology and theology when it comes to the architects. To them, the Veshral is both. She set the tablet down with more force than necessary. What have you found? Finn gestured at the display, where lines of code branched and intersected in patterns that made his eyes water. Good news and bad news. Good news is I've managed to access some of the deeper memory cores without getting electrocuted. Bad news is what I found there. He pulled up a file he'd spent the last 2 hours trying to decrypt, and the display filled with what looked like a star map overlaid with tactical projections. Sarethi leaned closer, her shoulder brushing his, and he felt the static charge of the Veshral's energy field respond to their proximity. These are territorial boundaries, she said, tracing a finger across the display without touching it. Architect holdings from before the collapse, but these markers, she indicated a series of red pulses spreading across the map like a contagion. I do not recognize this notation. That's because it's not in your people's records, Finn said. He pulled up another file, this one filled with corrupted data and fragments of what might have been images or might have been nightmares. I've been running translation algorithms on everything I can extract, and I keep hitting the same term over and over. The Veshral calls it the hollowing. Sarethi went very still. Continue. Near as I can figure, the hollowing was something the architects were fighting when they built these armors. Something that consumed entire civilizations by. And this is where the translation gets weird, collapsing consciousness into raw energy. Like it was harvesting minds. He brought up the countdown they'd seen earlier, and the Veshral thinks it's coming back. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of the armor's systems and the distant thrum of the station's engines. Sarethi reached out and steadied herself against the platform, and Finn realized her hands were shaking. How long? She asked. Based on this countdown, couple of weeks, maybe less. It's hard to tell because I'm pretty sure the architects didn't measure time the way we do. He minimized the tactical display and pulled up something else, a schematic that had taken him an hour to parse. But here's where it gets interesting. The Veshral wasn't just scanning for threats, it was scanning for something specific, a neural pattern. He highlighted a section of the schematic that showed a complex web of brainwave signatures, chemical markers, and cognitive patterns. This is what it was looking for. Some kind of hybrid consciousness that could interface with both organic intuition and synthetic logic in ways that neither humans nor Saravine alone could manage. And somehow, he turned to look at her. My brain chemistry happens to be a near-perfect match. Sarethi studied the schematic with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that would determine whether everyone she knew lived or died. The architects designed the Veshral to activate in the presence of this specific pattern, which means they anticipated the need for such a consciousness. She looked up at him. They built a failsafe that required cross-species cooperation. Right, and since your people have been alone in this sector for 16 centuries, the armor never had a chance to find its other half. Finn pulled up the combat protocol again, watched the countdown tick away microseconds that translated into days or hours or something in between. Until now. This is insane, Sarethi said, but there was no heat in it, just a kind of weary resignation. You are telling me that an ancient alien defense system has been waiting over a millennium for a human technician to wander into range, so it could activate protocols designed to fight an enemy that may or may not still exist. When you put it that way, it does sound pretty ridiculous, Finn admitted. He tapped a command into the interface, and the Veshral's energy fields flickered in response. But I've spent my entire career fixing things that shouldn't work and making sense of systems that defy logic. And everything I'm seeing here says the armor isn't malfunctioning, it's preparing. Sarethi moved away from the platform, pacing in tight circles that spoke of barely contained stress. Even if you are correct, even if the hollowing is returning, the assembly will never believe us. They will say we are fabricating a crisis to justify my claim to the throne. Counselor Tavish will argue that I am using you to manipulate the Veshral, that I am perverting its sacred purpose for political gain. So we prove it, Finn said. We run the deep synchronization protocols, unlock whatever the armor is trying to show us, and present evidence that even your most skeptical counselor can't ignore. Deep synchronization requires complete neural integration. I would have to cede partial control of the Veshral to you, allow your consciousness to merge with mine and with the armor's intelligence. It is, she stopped pacing, turned to face him fully. It is deeply intimate. You would experience my thoughts, my memories, everything that makes me who I am, and I would experience yours. Finn considered this. That does sound uncomfortable. It is also irreversible. Once the integration is complete, we would be permanently linked through the Veshral. Not telepathically, but we would know each other in ways that even lifelong companions never achieve. She met his eyes. You would be bound to me, and to my people's fate for the rest of your life. Well, Finn said, after a moment, I was getting bored with my old life anyway. She stared at him like he'd just announced his intention to walk into a star. You cannot simply joke your way through decisions of this magnitude. Watch me. He moved to the Veshral, placed his hand on its surface, felt the energy field stir in recognition. Look, I've spent my entire career being told things were impossible right up until I made them work. I've fixed drives that were supposedly dead, patched hulls that should have shattered, kept ships running on spite and improvisation. This. He gestured at the armor, at the data streaming across his displays, at the countdown marking the approach of something terrible. This is just another impossible problem. And if the solution is letting an ancient alien consciousness rummage around in my head while I help you save your civilization from an existential threat, then honestly, that's not even in my top 10 weirdest Tuesdays. Sarethi laughed, a short, sharp sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. You are either remarkably brave or remarkably stupid. I've been told there's not much difference. He turned back to face her, and something in his expression must have convinced her because he saw the moment she made her decision. When do we start? She pulled up her own interface, began entering commands that made the Veshral hum with anticipation. The synchronization felt like drowning in starlight. Finn's consciousness expanded outward until he couldn't tell where his thoughts ended and Saretha's began, couldn't distinguish between his memories of scraping by on salvage runs and her memories of diplomatic ceremonies that stretched for days. The Veshral threaded through both of them like a third presence, ancient and patient, guiding them through the integration with something that might have been approval. He saw her childhood, the weight of expectation placed on shoulders too young to bear it, the careful construction of composure over years of training. He felt her loneliness, the way duty had carved out everything else until she existed only as a symbol for her people. And beneath it all, he felt her terror that she might be the one to fail, the heir who finally broke the chain. In return, she witnessed his life in fragments, the colony that had slowly died around him, the stubborn refusal to accept that broken things had to stay broken, the humor he'd built like armor against a universe that seemed determined to grind people down. She felt his loneliness too, different from hers but no less profound, the isolation of always being the one who could fix everything except himself. The Veshral pulled them deeper, and suddenly they were somewhere else entirely. A memory not their own, vast and terrible. They saw the hollowing as the architects had seen it, a force that moved through space like a virus through flesh, leaving behind systems where every thinking being had simply stopped, their consciousness harvested and compressed into pure energy that fed something hungry and old. They saw the architect's desperate gambit, the creation of armors that could only activate when two incompatible neural patterns merged, because the hollowing had learned to consume any single form of consciousness, but had never encountered hybrid thought. The memory released them, and Finn gasped back into his own body to find himself on his knees beside Sarethi, both of them shaking with the aftershock of integration. The Veshral blazed with light, every conduit burning bright, and his hands, their hands, moved without conscious thought to interface with systems that had been dormant for over 1,000 years. "I can see everything," Sarethi whispered, and Finn knew she meant the armor's full capabilities, the weapons that rewrote local physics and the defensive arrays that could stabilize collapsing spacetime itself. "So can I," he said, and felt her presence in his mind, not intrusive but constant, like a second heartbeat. "This is going to take some getting used to. We do not have time to adjust." She stood, pulling him up with her, and he felt her determination flowing through their link like electricity. "The hollowing has already begun its advance. Long-range sensors are detecting anomalies at the drift's edge." They moved together to the chamber's central console, and Finn accessed the station's sensor network with a thought. The data confirmed what the Veshral had warned them about. Entire systems going silent along the border, their signals replaced by a low-frequency hum that made his teeth ache even through the recording. The hollowing was methodical, patient, and utterly inevitable. "The assembly needs to see this," Sarethi said, but Finn felt her doubt through their connection. She didn't believe they would listen. "Then we make them listen." He pulled up the Veshral's communication protocols, systems designed to interface with other architect relics scattered across the galaxy. "The armor isn't the only one, right? There are others, dormant, waiting for activation." Understanding flooded through their shared consciousness. "We use the Veshral as a beacon," Sarethi said. "We wake them all." They worked in perfect synchronization, their different perspectives complementing each other in ways that made the impossible seem routine. Finn handled the technical aspects, rerouting power and configuring transmission arrays, while Sarethi navigated the political implications, preparing messages that would convince her people this wasn't a desperate ploy. Through it all, the Veshral guided them, its ancient intelligence showing them connections and possibilities neither could have seen alone. The first activation sequence went live, and the armor's energy fields expanded beyond the chamber, beyond the station, reaching out across light years to touch systems that had slept since the architect's fall. Finn felt each connection like a string being plucked, felt the other armors stirring in response, recognizing the pattern they'd been designed to answer. Alarms began screaming across the station. The assembly was demanding explanations. Saretha's rivals were calling for her immediate arrest. And still the Veshral kept transmitting, kept calling, kept waking up an ancient defense network that had waited millennia for exactly this moment. "They are going to throw us both in detention," Sarethi said, but Finn felt her fierce satisfaction through their bond. She was smiling. "Probably," he agreed. "But look." On the display, markers began appearing across the star map, each one representing an architect relic coming online, adding its voice to the Veshral's call. Dozens, hundreds, a network spreading faster than the hollowing could advance, coordinating defenses across 1,000 worlds that had forgotten the architects ever existed. The door burst open and Counselor Tavish entered flanked by security, his expression promising consequences. "Princess Sarethi, you will cease this unauthorized." He stopped, staring at the display, at the web of light spreading across known space. "The right of succession has been satisfied," Sarethi said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. "The Veshral has recognized its bearer and activated protocols dormant since the Architect era. An existential threat approaches, Counselor, and this station now serves as the coordination point for a defense that spans the entire galactic arm." Tavish looked between them, at the armor blazing with power, at the way Finn and Sarethi stood together, as if they'd been fighting wars side by side for years instead of days. "This is unprecedented," he managed. "Yes," Finn said cheerfully. "We're very good at unprecedented, it's kind of our thing now." The following hours blurred together in a cascade of emergency meetings, hastily convened councils, and increasingly frantic attempts by various officials to understand what they were looking at. The sensor data couldn't be denied. The hollowing was real, advancing, and would have caught the entire sector unprepared if not for the warning. The Architect network couldn't be denied either, a defensive array more sophisticated than anything modern science could produce, now fully active and coordinating countermeasures. Finn stood on the observation deck as dawn broke over the station, watching ships from a dozen species converge on Threshold Sigil, responding to the beacon. Sarethi joined him, her presence in his mind a comfortable weight now, and they stood together in silence. "I have been alone my entire life," she said quietly. "Even surrounded by people, even with family and advisors and attendants, I have been alone." "I know," Finn said, because he did know, had felt it through their connection. "Me too." She turned to look at him, her long ears catching the light, and for the first time since they'd met she looked genuinely at peace. "We have a war to win," she said. "We do," he agreed. "But we don't have to win it alone." The Veshral hummed in approval somewhere in the back of their shared consciousness, and through their bond Finn felt Saretha's amusement at the armor's satisfaction. They had become what the architects had designed them to be.